Slavery must not be referred to as something of the past. By historically examining the 13th Amendment, the aftermath of emancipation, the war on drugs, and present-day prison populations, it can clearly be shown that slavery's system of oppression has evolved into something that appeared more legal and socially acceptable, but never truly ended. Many people are under the impression that slavery ended in 1807 and African American people were free to go about their lives. However, this couldn't be further from the truth. In actuality, the United States banned the slave trade in 1801, but not the practice of slavery until 1863. Today, through a loophole in the 13th Amendment, states are still profiting from the forced labor of predominantly black Americans in prison. Slavery gave America a fear of black people and a taste for violent punishment. Both still define our criminal justice system. In 1865, 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, the Constitution was ratified to include the 13th Amendment, which stated, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States." In other words, slavery and involuntary servitude were still legal, and still are, as long as they are punishments for a crime. This phrase in the 13th Amendment was not accidental, and America utilized this linguistic backdoor to continue slavery. Now all that the government had to do to continue benefiting from forced labor was turn newly freed African Americans into criminals, which was easy considering they had no power or rights. Convictions of minor crimes like vagrancy, loitering, and malicious mischief, which are all up to the discretion of the arresting officer, quickly created a large population of black prisoners, sending newly freed slaves into a new type of slavery. One of the ways in which black people were legally enslaved was through convict leasing. This practice was a transaction where prisons or jails provided convicts to private parties, like plantations or corporations, for lease. The leasee who was purchasing the convicts would pay the prison and be responsible for feeding, clothing, and housing them. Sound familiar? The prisoners were paid absolutely nothing for their work, and it did not shorten their sentence time. In 1871, the Virginia Supreme Court issued a ruling that declared a convicted person was a slave of the state. Once again, black bodies and black labor were for sale as a direct result of prison status. In addition to convict leasing, other legislation was created to restrict the freedom of black people and force them to work. Black codes were restrictive laws that targeted African Americans and became prevalent in the South after the Civil War. The blatant racism of these laws is clear in the name where black refers to the skin color of African American people. In 1865, just 2 years after emancipation, Mississippi enacted the first black code, requiring all African American men to have written evidence of employment for the entire year beginning every January. Because slaves were not taught to read or write and public education facilities were segregated, they were never given the chance to pursue any kind of job other than physical labor and were often forced to backpedal their freedom and seek work at plantations. They were subject to arrest if they attempted to leave the job before the contract was over, and any wages they had accumulated would be forfeited. According to W.E.B. Du Bois, the codes speak for themselves. No open-minded student can read them without being convinced that they meant nothing more or nothing less than slavery. Thus, the existence of black codes are further evidence that the American government had no intention of ending slavery. Furthermore, beginning in 1877, another round of laws specifically designed to oppress black people were passed. These were the Jim Crow laws that enforced radical racial segregation in the American South. These laws segregated every aspect of life: marriage, education, work, housing, transportation, child custody, libraries, bathrooms, water fountains, and even children's books. Unsurprisingly, Jim Crow laws also segregated prisons. Quote, "The warden shall see that the white convicts shall have separate apartments for both eating and sleeping from the Negro convicts." End quote. Jim Crow laws were outlawed in 1964, yet a disproportionately large percentage of the African American community is currently warehoused in prisons, a phenomenon that has come to be known as the New Jim Crow. Black Americans are criminally targeted by law enforcement, which lands them in prison where they are routinely denied basic civil and human rights, including the right to vote, the right to serve on juries, the right to be free of legal discrimination in employment, housing, and access to education and public benefits. By removing rights as a punishment for a crime, those who law enforcement and the government choose to imprison are systematically wiped of their power. In The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, she illustrates how it is no longer socially permissible to use race explicitly as a justification for discrimination, but it is perfectly legal to discriminate against convicted criminals in nearly all the ways in which it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once labeled a felon, even for a minor drug crime, the old forms of discrimination are suddenly legal. Although convict leasing ended in the 1930s, black codes ended in 1964 with the Civil Rights Act, and Jim Crow ended in 1965, these dates are still too current for comfort, and prisoners' labor continued to be exploited according to race. After the civil rights movement of the 60s, it became harder for blatant racism and slavery to continue, and the government knew they'd have to come up with more strategic approaches to oppression. The answer to this problem was Nixon's war on drugs, which started in the 70s and jump-started the spike in prison populations. This legislation implemented more sensitive and longer prison sentences for distribution, but most importantly, simple possession. This meant that having what was previously considered to be a nonviolent, misdemeanor amount of drugs could now be labeled as a violent crime and prosecuted as a felony. Furthermore, even though cocaine and crack are essentially the same substance, crack, which is actually less potent than powder cocaine but found more frequently among poor communities of color, was more heavily criminalized. This resulted in more African American people in jail with longer sentences than white people for the same drug. If it is unclear whether the intentions of this act were racist or not, listen to what Nixon's policy advisor has to say about it. Quote, "The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana, the blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." The war on drugs, which has come to be known as the war on black people, is one of many factors leading to high prison populations of African American people. However, black people are targeted for offenses other than drugs. In a way, history seems to be repeating itself with the fact that vagrancy laws, which are enforced disproportionately against black people, have started to reappear. These are the same crimes that birthed convict leasing and fueled the Southern economy. Michelle Alexander agrees that this is problematic and says, "The criminal justice system was strategically employed to force African Americans back into a system of extreme repression and control, a tactic that would continue to prove successful for generations to come. Therefore, it is understood that this racialized level of imprisonment is due to black people simply committing crimes at a higher rate than other races. But there is ample information to suggest that it is not always the case, and that the criminal justice system was designed to incarcerate more people of color." But all of that is in the past, right? Well, not entirely. More and more racist policies have been outlawed over the decades, but prisons still closely resemble plantations, and the population of inmates has gotten out of control. Even though the United States is referred to as the land of the free, it leads the world in incarceration, with over 2 million people behind bars. That's a 500% increase over the past 40 years. To give these numbers some perspective, the United States only has 5% of the world's population, but holds 25% of the world's prison population. In the words of Thomas Jefferson, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. At the same time that these words were written, more than 500,000 African people were slaves in the land of the free, and now there are 2.3 million black people in American prisons. To add to the irony, many colonists, including slave owners, verbally dismissed the practice as being immoral. Jefferson, who owned over 100 slaves, called it a hideous blot on America. George Washington, who also owned hundreds of slaves, denounced it as repugnant, and James Madison, a Virginia slave owner, condemned it as evil. However, Even though many people appeared to reject slavery, the Southern economy, which supported the rest of the country with cash crops, depended on forced labor. Many slave owners were in debt and weren't going to renounce the only practice keeping them afloat, financially speaking. In the same way that people rejected slavery yet still supported it, we are also guilty of theoretically dismissing slavery even though it continues in our prisons today. A prime example of the lasting legacy of slavery can be found at the Mississippi State Penitentiary, also known as Parchman Farm. Built in 1901, it was designed as a labor prison modeled after a plantation where cotton and other cash crops were grown. In the first year of it being open, the state made over $5 million off of the forced labor of black inmates, a textbook definition of slavery. Over the last 100 years, Parchman has gained a reputation for racism, brutality, and neglect. According to Garrett Felber, you enter not into a prison, but into a plantation. Mississippi is one of the 4 states with the highest death rates for prisoners. In January alone, 13 inmates died. Mississippi is the poorest state in the country, and it is also the blackest. Parchman currently holds 3,500 male inmates. 70% are black. The inhumane conditions at Parchman are horrifying. Prisoners don't have access to water, and even if they do, it's dirty water. There are decades of garbage lining the floors, no electricity for light or plumbing, rats, mold on food, and constant flooding inside the cells. Inmates have reported that they are too scared to sleep. The prisoners don't have individual beds and end up sleeping on the floors due to overcrowding. These men are stacked 6 to 8 people to a cell, the exact same way that captured Africans were packed on ships during the Middle Passage. These conditions are disgraceful, but possibly the most concerning is that while these inmates live through that environment, they are still expected to work. Parchman offenders provide over 100,000 hours of free, meaning they are not compensated, offender labor each year. Parchman is home to Mississippi Prison Industries Corporation, a program for textile and metal fabrication. Additionally, the majority of the farming activity involving Mississippi Prison agricultural enterprises takes place at Parchman. Yes, your thinking is correct. Parchman is literally a modern-day plantation, and its inmates are slaves. They cannot leave, they do not have rights, they live in inhumane conditions, and they are forced to work with no compensation. This is a lot to swallow, especially considering that it is not historical. The penitentiary is open as we speak, and the loophole in the 13th Amendment was successful in allowing slavery to legally continue. Challenging the idea that slavery never ended can seem radical, but that is because the same system that maintains it also keeps the evidence that it is still happening a secret from the general public. Of course, slavery has evolved from what it once was, and it is no longer illegal to enslave people for no reason, but that doesn't mean it isn't happening. The criminal justice system, including laws, courts, sentencing, and juries, were purposely designed to oppress black people who have literally been enslaved longer than they have been free. Therefore, by interrogating the historical significance behind the 13th Amendment and how that ties into current prison populations and practices within jails, it can be objectively shown that forms of slavery in America still exist. If this were not true, places like Parchman would not still be permitted to operate. Other laws, such as the one of 1662 in Virginia that made any child of a slave also a slave, show that the systematic and automatic oppression of black people, or anyone who appeared black, was intentional before it was even frowned upon. As Michelle Alexander writes in The New Jim Crow, the notion of white supremacy rationalized the enslavement of Africans, even as whites endeavored to form a new nation based on the ideals of equality, liberty, and justice for all. Under the terms of our country's founding, slaves were defined as 3/5 of a man, not a real whole human, and this rings true today. Frederick Douglass, a former slave who became one of the most well-known African-American leaders of the 1800s, called slavery the greatest sin and shame of America. It is unfortunate that we cannot tell those people from the past that the slavery is over.